All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Millionaire, architectural historian. The crystal flute of Dom Perignon caught the light from the single candle between us, casting a prism of rainbows onto the pristine white tablecloth. 12 years. A dozen orbits around the sun since I'd said I do to the man sitting across from me. Daniel. His face, still so handsome, was softened by the flickering flame, his smile practiced, perfect. He was telling a story about a recent project, a new commercial build in the Denver Tech Center. And the client, a real micromanager, insisted on a last-minute change to the facade. Wanted more glass, less composite panel. So I had to get the structural engineer on the line, the glazing contractor, and of course, Sarah was there. She's been a godsend. She managed to coordinate the new delivery timelines with the supplier in record time, Sarah. My cousin. Sarah with the laugh that sounded like wind chimes and a hug that felt like coming home. Sarah, who had held my hair back when I was sick at 16, who had been my maid of honor, who now worked as a project coordinator at Daniel's firm. I took a slow sip of the champagne. It was dry, crisp, and tasted like ashes. My eyes were fixed on Daniel's mouth as he spoke, the words flowing a little too smoothly. It was incredible, Elle. She just handled it. Called in a favor from some guy she knew from her old job, got the glass spec'd, ordered, and delivered all within 48 hours. The client was ecstatic. We took the team out for drinks to celebrate at that new speakeasy on Larimer, the one with the terrible, overpriced cocktails. You'd hate it. He laughed, a warm, familiar sound that usually made me feel safe. Tonight, it felt like a door closing in a distant part of the house. Something was wrong. It wasn't one thing, it was the architecture of the lie. The story was too detailed, too neat. The pacing was off. A good story, a true story, has rough edges, pauses for recollection, tangents. This was a polished narrative, rehearsed and delivered with the precision of a TED Talk. He mentioned the speakeasy's name, the type of cocktails, the client micromanaging tendencies, the 48-hour window, all irrelevant details that served no purpose other than to add verisimilitude. But true memories aren't built like that. They are messy structures, full of forgotten corners and load-bearing emotions, not this prefabricated perfection. My mind, trained to diagnose the structural integrity of buildings based on subtle cracks and shifts, was now applying the same brutal logic to my marriage. Sarah was there? I asked, my voice neutral, a historian examining an artifact. Of course, she's the coordinator. She's always there. He didn't miss a beat, but his eyes, the color of a Colorado sky, flickered down to his plate for a fraction of a second too long. A crack in the foundation. The memory of a week ago slammed into me. I'd been looking for a receipt for a charity donation in his wallet, a donation he'd asked me to handle, and my fingers had brushed against a small, rigid card. I'd pulled it out. A key card from the Oxford Hotel, a historic, romantic place we'd stayed at once years ago. He'd plucked it from my fingers with a laugh so forced it was almost a cough. Oh, that, from the client summit last month. Must have forgotten to toss it. He'd torn it in half and thrown it in the trash. I'd let it go. A historian must sometimes ignore the small, anomalous artifact until more evidence presents itself. Now, more evidence was presenting itself, in the form of a story that was too perfect. She's been working late a lot with you, I commented, cutting a piece of my filet mignon. It was perfectly medium rare, but I might as well have been eating cardboard. This project is a beast, we all have. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His skin was warm. I remembered the first time he'd held my hand, in a college library, his fingers stained with ink from a leaky pen. Now, his hands were clean, manicured. But it's almost over. Then I'm all yours again, I promise. We'll take that trip to Santa Fe you've been talking about. Look at the adobe structures. Another detail. A promise tailored specifically to my passions. It was a supporting beam added to shore up the shaky narrative. I felt a coldness seeping into my bones, a glacial calm. I was an architectural historian standing in the grand hall of my own life, and I could suddenly see that the entire east wing was a meticulously crafted facade, a Hollywood set piece hiding a void. Daniel, I said, my voice so quiet he had to lean in. The restaurant hummed around us, a symphony of clinking silverware and murmured conversations. Look at me. He did. His smile was still in place, but I saw the slight tension around his eyes, the minute effort it took to hold that gaze. The Oxford Hotel Client Summit was 6 weeks ago, not last month. And the speakeasy on Larimer doesn't serve terrible cocktails, it's won awards for them. You described the one on Blake Street. I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us like a wrecking ball. And Sarah is allergic to champagne. She breaks out in hives. She would never have celebrated with drinks at a bar that specializes in them. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of a crushing truth. I watched the narrative in his eyes collapse. The practiced smile dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. The charming, confident architect was gone, and in his place was a man caught, his shoddy construction exposed. "Eleanor, he stammered, but I wasn't listening. I was reconstructing the timeline, the late nights, the new cologne, the way he'd suddenly started taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered. The time I'd called his office, and the receptionist said he'd left for the day with Sarah for a site visit. The pieces of my life, which I had thought formed a beautiful, stable structure, were suddenly rubble at my feet. "It's Sarah, isn't it?" The question wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, cold and hard as granite. His face crumpled. He didn't deny it. He just looked down at his hands, and a single, fat tear slid down his cheek and onto the white tablecloth, creating a dark, spreading stain. In that moment, the 12 years of our marriage didn't feel like a beautiful building. They felt like a historical reconstruction that had just failed a stress test. The foundation, trust, had been made of sand, and the entire thing was coming down. The champagne, the candlelight, the anniversary, it was all just decorative molding on a house that was already condemned. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my wine in his face. I simply stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were in a museum and didn't want to disturb the exhibits. "I need air," I said, my voice echoing strangely in my own ears. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him there with the ruins of our anniversary dinner. The Colorado night air was cool and sharp, a shocking contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the headlights of cars stream by, each one a life moving forward while mine had just imploded. The hook wasn't just the discovery. It was the calm, the terrifying, analytical calm with which I dissected the collapse. I was a historian of my own disaster, and the excavation had only just begun. The world had become a museum of our former life, and I was its sole, unwilling curator. Every room was an exhibit of betrayal. The living room, where we'd chosen the sofa together, now held the ghost of his confession. The kitchen, where he'd made me coffee every morning for 12 years, felt like a stage for a play that had closed abruptly. I moved through the house like a specter, my silence a stark contrast to the violent demolition happening inside my chest. Daniel was staying in a hotel. He'd called a dozen times, sent 100 texts, a flurry of excuses and pleas that I deleted without reading. Their words were just noise, the meaningless chatter of tourists in the ruins of my heart. I had granted myself a week of silence. A week to not be a wife, a historian, a rational adult. A week to simply be a raw, exposed nerve. My son, Leo, was at a friend's for a sleepover. The silence in the house was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. I stood in the center of the living room, wrapped in Daniel's old Yale sweatshirt, a relic I'd stolen for years because it smelled like him. Now it smelled like laundry detergent and lies. The grief wasn't a clean, linear thing. It was a chaotic, non-Euclidean space. One moment I was numb, a frozen statue in the gallery of my grief. The next, a seismic wave of anger would tear through me, so violent I thought my bones would splinter. Then, just as quickly, it would recede, leaving behind a vast, desolate landscape of sorrow. I was an architect studying the blueprints of a collapsed building, and I couldn't find the single point of failure. It was a systemic issue. The load-bearing walls of trust, respect, and shared history had all been compromised. I found myself in front of the large bookcase that spanned the entire west wall. It was our shared history, in hardback and paperback. His books on structural engineering and modernist theory stood shoulder to shoulder with my volumes on Gothic cathedrals and Art Deco preservation. I ran my fingers along the spines, a tactile timeline of us. My eyes landed on a thick white photo album embossed with the words "Our Beginning" in elegant silver script, a relic from a more naive era. I pulled it out, its weight surprising me. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, and opened it on my lap. There we were, young, stupid, and glowing with a future that felt infinite. A picture from our first vacation together in Santa Fe. We were standing in front of the San Miguel mission, his arms slung around my shoulders, my head thrown back in laughter. I was pointing at something on the adobe wall, likely explaining the historical significance of the mud plaster. He was looking at me, not at the wall, with an expression of such rapt attention I had thought he was fascinated by the architecture. Now, I wondered if he was just fascinated by me, or if he was merely playing the part of the attentive boyfriend. Another page, our wedding. Me in my grandmother's lace gown, him in a classic black tux. We were cutting the cake, his hand over mine on the knife handle. We were smiling, but now I could see the subtle tension in my jaw, the slight performative aspect of his grin. Had the cracks been there even then, too fine for the human eye to see, only visible under the high-powered microscope of hindsight? I turned the page again. A photo from a party. There, in the background, was Sarah. She was holding a glass of wine, smiling at the camera. But her body was angled towards Daniel, her shoulder almost touching his. A casual, cousinly pose, or was it a claim? My mind, now a weaponized analysis tool, began to recontextualize every memory, every interaction. That time she'd cried on his shoulder after a bad breakup. The inside jokes they shared that I never quite understood. The way he'd always defended her, that's just Sarah being Sarah. A sound ripped from my throat, a guttural, animal thing that was part sob, part roar. It was too much. The pristine narrative of our love story was a forgery, and this album was the proof. I slammed the album shut, but the fury didn't subside. It needed an outlet. It needed destruction. I didn't go for his things. That felt too predictable, too cliché. I went for our things, the symbols. I started with the wedding album. I didn't rip the photos. Instead, I carried it to the kitchen, filled the sink with soapy water, and submerged it. I watched as the water darkened the creamy pages, as the "Our Beginning" script blurred and ran. I held it under until the bubbles stopped, until the past was officially waterlogged and drowned. Then, I moved to the living room. There was a ceramic vase on the mantelpiece. A hideous, lumpy thing we'd bought together at a roadside stand on a trip to Taos. We'd laughed so hard at its ugliness, but we'd bought it anyway, a testament to our shared sense of humor. It had been a cherished inside joke for a decade. Now, the joke was on me. I picked it up. It was cool and smooth in my hands. I didn't throw it against the wall. I simply opened the front door and dropped it onto the concrete porch. It shattered with a profoundly satisfying, high-pitched crash. Piece by piece, I dismantled the museum. A silly mug from Disneyland. A framed print of a M.C. Escher drawing we both loved. A cheap snow globe from Chicago. I didn't destroy everything. I was a historian, after all. I was selective. I curated the destruction, removing the artifacts of us that caused the most acute pain. I boxed them up not for him, but for the dump. This wasn't about giving him his stuff back. It was about excising a tumor. 3 hours later, I stood in the center of the living room, breathing heavily. The room was littered with empty spaces on shelves, lighter patches on the walls where frames had hung. It looked ransacked. It looked like a home that had been burglarized. In a way, it had been. The front door opened. "Mom, I'm home." Leo, my sweet 9-year-old boy, with Daniel's eyes and my own quiet curiosity. He stopped short in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes wide as he took in the disarray. "Whoa, what happened in here? Are we redecorating?" I looked at my son, at the confusion and nascent worry on his face, and the violent energy drained out of me, replaced by a crushing, protective love. I could burn the world down, but I couldn't let him breathe the smoke. I forced a smile, one that felt like it cracked my face. "Something like that, sweetie. Just clearing out some old stuff we don't need anymore." He nodded slowly, his gaze falling on the box by the door filled with ceramic shards from the vase. "Okay, can I have a peanut butter sandwich?" And just like that, life demanded to continue. The world kept spinning even as mine had flown off its axis. His simple, mundane request was an anchor. It was also a stark reminder. The structure of my life hadn't just been about Daniel and me. There was another, more important wing to this building, and it was still standing, still needed shelter. I had to be careful. My demolition couldn't become his collapse. As I spread peanut butter on whole wheat bread, the thought that had been gnawing at the edges of my consciousness finally took solid form. I couldn't stay here, not in this museum of ghosts. I needed to go somewhere where the architecture of the landscape had no memories of us. I needed to be in a place so raw, so powerful, and so indifferent to my human drama that it would swallow my pain whole. I needed to go to Iceland. It wasn't a plan. It was an impulse, a geographic cure, a solo trip with no plan. It was the most reckless, most necessary thought I'd had in 12 years. And as I handed Leo his sandwich, I knew, with a certainty that felt like the first solid foundation I'd stood on in days, that I was going. Iceland was not a country, it was a state of being. A primordial, raw nerve of the planet, where the Earth's crust was thin and its heart was fire and ice. The moment I stepped out of Keflavik Airport, the wind stole my breath. It wasn't the gentle breeze of a Colorado autumn. It was a relentless, horizontal force that screamed of glaciers and vast, empty spaces. It scoured me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than the suffocating weight of betrayal. I felt small, insignificant, and it was a relief. My plan of no plan was both terrifying and liberating. I'd rented a rugged, mud-splattered Dacia Duster, its steering wheel feeling alien in my hands. I had a paper map, a deliberate rejection of the digital world that had delivered my ruin, and a single night booked at a guest house in Reykjavik. After that, the void. The guest house was a modest, colorful building, but my room felt like a cell. The silence was different from the one in my Colorado home. That had been a silence full of ghosts. This was a silence full of nothing, and the nothing was loud. I lasted 3 hours. Throwing my single backpack into the car, I pointed the nose of the Duster east, towards the ring road, and drove away from the faint lights of the city, into the consuming darkness. For the first few hours, I drove in a trance. The landscape was a monochrome study in desolation. Lava fields stretched to the horizon, covered in a thick, spongy moss the color of army fatigues. The sky was a low, heavy ceiling of clouds, and a fine, cold mist hung in the air, beating on the windshield. There were no trees, no familiar landmarks. It was like driving on the moon. My mind, which had been a tangled knot of forensic analysis, dissecting every word, every glance, every lie, had nothing to latch onto. The internal noise began to quiet, replaced by the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road and the constant, whispering rush of the wind. I pulled over at a random viewpoint, a place not marked as significant on my map. I got out of the car, the wind immediately whipping my hair across my face. Before me was a vast, black sand plain, and in the distance, the jagged, ice-blue teeth of a glacier gnawing at the horizon. The scale of it was humbling. My marriage, which had felt like the entire architecture of my universe, was suddenly reduced to a single, crumbling brick in an impossibly large cathedral. Daniel's betrayal was a microscopic crack in this continental plate. A sob welled up in my throat, but it wasn't born of self-pity. It was born of a profound, terrifying perspective. I had spent my life studying buildings made by men, their ambitions, their flaws, their temporary beauty. But this was creation and destruction on a timescale I couldn't comprehend. I was standing on a land that was still being born, where volcanoes regularly erased everything and ice carved new valleys. What was my pain compared to that? I got back in the car and drove. My destination became the Jökulsárlón Glacier Lagoon, a place I'd seen in photographs, but whose reality I was utterly unprepared for. I arrived as the weak Arctic light was beginning to fade, casting the world in shades of silver and blue. The lagoon was a surreal, dreamlike tableau. The water was a milky, opaque turquoise, littered with icebergs of impossible shapes and sizes. They were sculptures carved by nature, each one a unique, transient masterpiece. Some were a stark, brilliant white like freshly fallen snow. Others were a deep, crystalline blue, the color of a winter twilight. They were streaked with dark volcanic ash, the geological record of ancient eruptions frozen in time. I walked along the black sand shore, the diamonds of ice and chunks of the icebergs that had washed ashore, glittering at my feet. The air was cold and clean, smelling of ice and salt. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water, the occasional groaning crack of a calving glacier in the distance, and the mournful cry of a lone seabird. I found a small, chair-sized iceberg that had beached itself and sat on it, the cold seeping through my jeans. I watched the larger icebergs drift slowly, majestically, towards the open ocean. They moved with a silent, inevitable grace. They were what they were. They didn't apologize for their sharp edges or their cold hearts. They were born from fracture, from the glacier letting go, and now they were on their own journey, slowly melting, changing, returning to the sea. A connection fired in my brain, a spark of understanding so clear it was almost audible. I was an iceberg. My marriage had been the glacier. A massive, seemingly permanent structure, built up over years, layer upon layer of shared experiences, inside jokes, quiet mornings, and anniversaries. And then it had calved. The trauma of Daniel's betrayal had been that violent, shocking separation, the cracking off of a huge piece of myself into the unknown. I was now adrift. I was cold, isolated, and jagged. I was dangerous to anyone who came too close. But I was also beautiful in my own, stark way. And I was moving. However slowly, however painfully, I was no longer part of that stagnant, compromised structure. I was on my own path, destined to change, to melt, to become something else entirely. The process was terrifying, but it was natural. It was necessary. I reached into the pocket of my coat, my fingers closing around the cold, smooth metal of my wedding band. I hadn't taken it off. It had felt like a part of my body, a shackle I was too afraid to remove. Now I pulled it off. It felt loose. I held it in my palm, looking at the simple gold circle that had symbolized a promise so completely broken. I didn't throw it into the lagoon in a dramatic gesture. That would have been giving it too much importance, making it the climax of this scene. Instead, I simply opened my fingers and let it drop. It fell onto the black sand between the diamonds of ice, a small, dull yellow circle against the profound, glittering landscape. It was insignificant. I left it there, a tiny artifact for the tide to eventually claim. I stood up, my body stiff with cold, but my heart felt strangely, cautiously light. The wind had dried the tears on my cheeks before they could even fall. I was still adrift. I was still melting. But for the first time, I saw the journey not as a punishment, but as a transformation. The path ahead was still shrouded in mist, but I knew I wouldn't be going back to the glacier. I was headed for the open sea. Back in the car, with the heater blasting, I looked at the map. My finger traced the ring road further east towards the fjords. I had no hotel, no reservation. It didn't matter. I had a full tank of gas, a bag of groceries, and a new, fragile sense of direction. I turned the key, the engine sputtered to life, and I drove on, leaving the glittering diamonds and my golden past behind me in the deepening twilight. Returning to Colorado was like stepping back into a detailed, meticulously rendered model of a life I no longer lived. The air was thin and familiar, the mountains a postcard-perfect backdrop to my disarray. The house, which I had semi-demolished, now felt like a preserved ruin. I had no desire to rebuild it to its former state. That blueprint was ashes. The practicalities of uncoupling a 12-year life were a special kind of torture. Lawyers' emails replaced love letters. Financial disclosures were the new pillow talk. Daniel, through his attorney, was being scrupulously fair, which infuriated me more than if he'd been a villain. It's easier to demolish a structure when you can paint it as entirely corrupt. But he was leaving the door open for a semblance of amiability, for the sake of Leo, and it forced me to wear a mask of civility that chafed against my raw nerves. Leo was struggling. He was quiet, too quiet, and had started asking if he'd done something wrong. His question broke what was left of my heart into even smaller pieces. I assured him, over and over, that he was the best thing to ever happen to me, that this was about grown-up problems. But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he'd flinch when a door slammed too hard. My personal earthquake had created aftershocks in his small world. It was in this atmosphere of legal dust and emotional fallout that the idea took root. I needed a new architecture for my soul, something with a foundation I could pour myself, walls I could raise alone. The memory of Iceland's vast, silent spaces was still with me, a calming presence, but I couldn't live inside a glacier. I needed a structure. I was cleaning out the spare room, a space that had been a catch-all for Daniel's golf clubs and my half-finished projects, when I saw the old, neglected keyboard tucked away in the closet. It was a cheap, plastic thing I'd bought on a whim years ago, intending to learn and had never touched. I pulled it out, dust raining down. It was light, insubstantial, a toy compared to the grandeur of a real piano. But it had keys, black and white, an alphabet of sound. I set it up on a small table in the corner of the living room, now stripped of its sentimental artifacts. It looked lonely and out of place, a stark, modern sculpture in a room of traditional furniture. I plugged it in, the red power light glowing like a single, watchful eye. I sat on the stool I'd dragged in from the kitchen and stared at the keys. My hands, capable of analyzing the stress points in a flying buttress or the provenance of a cornice, felt like clumsy, foreign objects. I pressed a white key. A note sounded, thin and reedy through the small speaker. A C, I pressed the one next to it. D, I played a scale, my fingers stumbling, the notes disjointed and awkward. There was no melody, only a sequence. It was the architectural equivalent of stacking bricks without mortar. I found a beginner's book online, Piano for Adult Beginners. The title felt both patronizing and encouraging. The first lesson was about hand position, about curling my fingers as if holding an invisible apple. It felt absurd. The second lesson was about middle C and a simple 5-note exercise. The notes were represented by little letters on a staff, a cryptic code I had to decipher. The first practice session was a study in frustration. My left hand refused to cooperate with my right. My fingers, more used to typing and turning pages, were stiff and uncoordinated. The simple exercise, a rising and falling pattern of 5 notes, sounded like a child randomly mashing the keyboard. I was a scholar, a professional who commanded respect in her field, and I was being bested by Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But then, something shifted. On the third day, as the weak morning light filtered through the windows, I managed to play the 5-note sequence without a mistake. The notes connected, flowing into a simple, recognizable phrase. It wasn't music, not yet, but it was order. It was cause and effect. I pressed the keys and the sound was produced. My agency was direct, unmediated by the lies or actions of another person. In that simple, mechanical success, I found a crack in the wall of my grief. It wasn't the grand, sweeping perspective of Iceland. This was intimate. This was mine. I started waking up an hour earlier, before Leo stirred, to practice. The house, in that pre-dawn stillness, became a sanctuary. The only light was the small lamp over the keyboard, pooling on the plastic keys. The only sounds were my slow, deliberate notes and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. In that quiet space, I wasn't Alina the betrayed wife, or Alina the struggling single mother, or Alina the architectural historian. I was just a student, a beginner. The piano became a metaphor for my recovery. I had to learn to read a new language. I had to train my muscles to do unfamiliar things. I had to be patient with mistakes. A wrong note wasn't a catastrophe, it was data. I would stop, go back, and try again. Slowly, painstakingly, I built tiny musical structures, a major chord, a minor chord. The minor chord, a cluster of 3 notes, sounded like my sadness given voice. It was a beautiful, haunting sound. I played it over and over, not to wallow, but to acknowledge it, to give my grief a shape and a form outside of myself. One Saturday afternoon, while Leo was at a friend's house, I was attempting a simple version of a Bach minuet. It was still far beyond my skill, a complex interweaving of 2 hands, but I was doggedly trying to parse its logic. I was so absorbed in the struggle that I didn't hear the front door open. "Mom!" I jumped, my hands crashing down on the keys in a discordant jangle. Leo stood in the doorway, his head cocked. "You're playing piano?" he asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and surprise. "Trying to," I said, feeling a flush of self-consciousness. "I'm not very good." He came and stood next to me, looking at the keyboard with serious eyes. "It doesn't sound bad, it's just slow." I laughed, a real, unforced sound that felt strange in my throat. "Yeah, it's very slow." "Can you play something?" he asked, my heart squeezed. I knew about 5 things, all from the first 10 pages of the book. I took a breath, positioned my hands with exaggerated care, and played the simple 5-finger exercise of Ode to Joy. It was plodding, robotic, devoid of any feeling, but I hit every note correctly. When I finished, Leo was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Cool," he said, and then, "Can I have pizza for dinner?" And in that moment, something settled inside me. The world hadn't ended. I was learning something new. My son still wanted pizza. The structure of a day, of a life, could be rebuilt note by note, moment by moment. It would be a different composition than the one I'd planned, slower, perhaps with more minor keys, but it was mine to write. The excavation was over. The construction had begun. The offices of Sterling and Crest, architectural preservation, were housed in a beautifully restored 1920s bank building in downtown Denver. Walking back through the heavy brass doors felt like stepping into a past life. The scent of old paper, lemon polish, and coffee was the same. The sound of hushed professional voices and the gentle hum of the climate control system were the same, but I was different. The Alina who had last worked here, just a few months ago, had been a woman with a life neatly framed and hung on a solid wall. Now, I was a woman carrying a bag of loose, sharp fragments, trying to find a new mortar to hold them together. My first week back was a study in careful reassembly. My colleagues were politely supportive, their greetings tinged with a careful pity they tried to hide. "Good to have you back, Alina," they'd say, their eyes skittering away from mine a second too quickly. They knew the world of high-end architecture and preservation in Denver was a small town. Daniel's firm was a major player. News of our split had undoubtedly rippled through the gossip channels. I hated the pity. It felt like being labeled a fragile historical artifact, handle with care. My salvation was work. I was assigned to a new project, the renovation and adaptive reuse of the old Blackstone Theater, a gorgeous but decaying Art Deco masterpiece from the 1930s. It was a complex, demanding project, exactly what I needed. It required my full attention, forcing my mind away from the labyrinth of my own pain and into the precise geometry of structural integrity, historical accuracy, and modern building codes. I spent my days buried in blueprints, historical surveys, and material samples. The theater was a beautiful ruin, its gilded plaster cherubs chipped, its velveteen seats moth-eaten, its grand curtain heavy with dust. But I could see its bones. I could see the grandeur it once held. My job was to help it sing again without erasing the patina of its years. It was, I realized with a jolt, not so different from my own task. It was on a Tuesday during a project meeting that I first encountered him. We were in the conference room, the large mahogany table strewn with plans. My boss, Martin, was at the head of the table. And for the modern annex, the glass box connector between the original theater and the new office space, we've brought in a specialist. His firm comes highly recommended for this kind of sensitive, contemporary intervention. Alina, you'll be working closely with him to ensure the new design dialogues respectfully with the historic fabric. Meet Alexander Xander Thorne. The man who stood up from the other side of the table was not what I expected. I'd anticipated someone older, bespectacled, perhaps wearing a turtleneck. Xander Thorne was probably in his early 40s, with the kind of rugged, lived-in face that suggested he spent as much time on construction sites as he did behind a desk. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his hand, when he reached across the table to shake mine, was calloused, the grip firm and warm. "Alina," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. "I've read your monograph on the Art Deco influences in Colorado's civic architecture. It's brilliant. Your analysis of the Daniels and Fisher Tower was particularly insightful." I was taken aback. Most architects I worked with, especially the ones focused on contemporary design, viewed my historical preservation work as a necessary obstacle, a series of tedious rules to be circumvented. They didn't read my monographs. "Thank you," I managed, retrieving my hand. "That's very kind." The meeting proceeded, and I watched him. He listened intently, his gaze focused and thoughtful. When he spoke about his design for the glass annex, he didn't use the jargon-filled, ego-driven language I was used to. He talked about light and reflection and creating a vessel that would hold the memory of the old building without mimicking it. "The glass won't be perfectly transparent," he explained, pointing to a rendering. "It'll have a slight greenish tint. During the day, it will reflect the historic facade, a ghost of the past. At night, when the theater is lit up, the annex will become a lantern, showing the life within. It's not a separate building. It's a conversation. A conversation." The word resonated deep within me. My life had become a monologue of grief, a silent scream in an empty house. The idea of a conversation, of an exchange that was respectful and dynamic, felt like a foreign, beautiful concept. After the meeting, as people filed out, he approached my end of the table. "I meant what I said about your work," he said, his tone earnest. "Too many people see old buildings as dead things. You treat them like living entities with stories to tell. It's a rare skill. I suppose it's easier to analyze the stories of stones and steel than the stories of people," I said, the words coming out more bitterly than I intended. He looked at me for a long moment, his head slightly tilted. His eyes were a warm, intelligent brown. "Maybe, but the principles aren't so different. Foundation, structure, the weathering of time, the need for a safe shelter." A safe shelter. My throat tightened. I simply nodded, unable to form a response. "We should schedule a site visit," he continued, seemingly unaware of the emotional landmine he'd just stepped on. "I'd value your perspective on the points where the new structure meets the old. The junctures are always the most critical part." "Of course," I said, my professional facade snapping back into place. "Just have your assistant coordinate with mine." He gave a small, easy smile. "I don't have an assistant. Small firm. I'll email you directly." He left the conference room, and I stood there for a moment, alone amidst the scattered blueprints. The encounter had left me feeling off balance. The professional admiration was one thing, but the directness, the lack of pretense, the calloused hands of an architect who clearly also built things, it was disarming. For the first time since my life had collapsed, a person from the outside world had seen me not as the betrayed wife, but as a respected peer. He had looked at the historian, not the ruin. It was a small thing, a single, stable stone placed on the unstable ground of my new life. But as any good historian knows, even the grandest cathedrals are built one stone at a time. I gathered my papers, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in my chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was the faint, tentative curiosity of an archaeologist who has just brushed away the dust to find the edge of something new. The Blackstone Theater was a skeleton waiting for its new skin. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of old performances and the sharp, honest sense of sawdust and damp plaster. Scaffolding climbed the walls like ivy, and dust motes danced in the slants of light cutting through the boarded-up windows. It was a cathedral in the midst of its own resurrection. I stood at the edge of the orchestra pit, my hard hat feeling alien on my head, a copy of the original architectural plans rolled tightly in my hand. I was early. I'd wanted a moment alone with the building, to feel its silence and its needs before the practicalities of the meeting began. I ran my gloved hand over a section of the proscenium arch, my fingers tracing the carved, geometric patterns unique to the Art Deco period. The gilding was mostly gone, but the craftsmanship was still there, stubborn and proud. "It's got good bones, hasn't it?" The voice, that calm baritone, didn't startle me. It felt like it belonged in the space, as much a part of the renovation as the scaffolding. I turned to see Xander walking down the center aisle, his own hard hat perched on his head, a tool belt slung low on his hips. He looked even more at home here than he had in the boardroom. "The bones are magnificent," I agreed, turning back to the arch. "It's the connective tissue that's failing. The plaster here is keyed into the lath, but decades of moisture." I tapped a section, and a small piece of the intricate carving crumbled away, falling to the floor in a puff of white dust. I winced. "A tragedy." "No," he said, coming to stand beside me. He didn't look at the fallen piece, but at the larger structure. "It's just history, and history isn't about preserving something in amber. It's about understanding the story of the wear and tear. Our job isn't to stop time, it's to write the next chapter in a way that honors the previous ones." His words echoed the realization I'd had on the iceberg in Iceland. I was no longer trying to preserve my old life in amber. I was trying to write a new chapter. I looked at him, truly looked at him. There was no pity in his eyes, only a shared, professional reverence for the task at hand. "So, the junctures," I said, unrolling the plans on a nearby work table we'd cleared of debris. "Your glass box meets the historic masonry here and here." I pointed to the points on the drawing. "The seismic differential alone is a nightmare. The old building moves one way, your new structure another. If you hard-weld the connection, something will crack." "A lesson you learn quickly living in California," he nodded, his gaze intense on the drawings. "You don't fight the movement, you accommodate it. I'm proposing a sliding joint system here with a flexible sealant. It allows for independent movement without compromising the envelope." We fell into a deep, technical discussion. It was a dance of minds. He spoke the language of loads and tolerances, of modern materials and structural poetry. I spoke the language of historical context, of material integrity, and of preserving the building's soul. We weren't arguing, we were problem-solving. He'd propose a solution, and I'd challenge it from a preservation standpoint. I'd suggest a historical detail, and he'd engineer a way to make it work with the new design. At one point, we climbed the scaffolding to get a closer look at the ceiling domes. We were high above the empty seats, the vast space of the theater yawning below us. It was dizzying, but also exhilarating. "Look at this," he said, his voice hushed. He wasn't pointing at a structural beam, but at a small, painted detail in a corner of the dome, a tiny, faded star that had been hidden in shadow. The craftsmen who did this, they put beauty where no one would ever see it, just for the sake of it being there, just for the integrity of the thing. Something about that hidden star, that secret beauty, unlocked a part of me I had sealed shut. The professionalism, the careful distance, it crumbled like the bad plaster. "My husband had an affair with my cousin," I said. The words were out, blunt and stark, hanging in the dusty air between us. I didn't know why I said it. Maybe it was the height, the isolation, the shared reverence for something broken but beautiful. Maybe it was because he had seen the hidden star. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply turned his head from the painted star to look at me, his brown eyes steady and calm. "That's a profound kind of betrayal," he said, his voice low. "It violates multiple layers of trust at once. It's like not just stealing a treasured artifact, but desecrating the temple it was housed in." The accuracy of his metaphor stole my breath. Yes, that was exactly it. He hadn't just broken a vow. He had profaned the entire sanctuary of my life. "I'm sorry," I said, suddenly embarrassed. "That was wildly unprofessional." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It's context. We're not just fixing a building a leaner. We're rebuilding a sense of place. How can I understand how you want to preserve this theater's soul if I don't have a glimpse of the work you're doing on your own?" Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I looked away, back at the tiny, perfect star. "I found out at our anniversary dinner," I whispered. "He told a story that was too perfect. The architecture of the lie was flawed. I could see the cracks." Xander was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My father was a contractor. He used to say you can always tell a shoddy job by the details the client will never see. The quality of the plumbing in the walls, the foundation prep, the truth of the work is in the hidden places. The lie is usually in the fancy finish." We stood there in silence for a while, two figures on a scaffold, surrounded by the skeleton of a grand old dream. The air no longer felt thick with ghosts, but with a quiet, shared understanding. He hadn't tried to fix me. He hadn't offered empty sympathy. He had simply listened, and then reframed my pain in a language I understood. The language of structure and integrity. When we climbed down, the world below felt different. Lighter. We spent the next 2 hours finalizing the connection details, our collaboration now infused with a new, unspoken ease. As we were packing up to leave, he pulled a thermos from his bag. "I don't trust the site coffee," he said. "It tastes like metal shavings and despair. This is from a little place near my workshop." "Black, right?" I stared at him. I had never told him how I took my coffee. He remembered from a throwaway comment I'd made in the conference room weeks ago, a comment I'd forgotten I'd even made. "Yes," I said, my voice slightly unsteady. "Black." He poured a capful and handed it to me. The coffee was rich, dark, and perfect. It was the first truly good, simple pleasure I'd allowed myself in months. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about the fact that he'd remembered. In the midst of my ruin, someone had seen a small, specific detail about me and had committed it to memory. It was a single, perfectly laid brick in the foundation of something new. The world had acquired a new frequency, one tuned to the quiet hum of anticipation. My days settled into a new rhythm, a ternary form, the slow, patient reconstruction of my life with Leo, the deep, satisfying work on the theater, and the unexpected, bright notes of my conversations with Xander. It wasn't a dramatic courtship. It was a gradual rewiring, a restoration of my capacity for trust, one carefully laid brick at a time. Our collaboration became a series of small, deliberate discoveries. He never pushed. He was simply, consistently, there. A text message with a photo of a building detail he thought I'd appreciate. Saw this corbel in Cap Hill. Reminded me of your lecture on Chicago school influence. An email with a link to a podcast about the history of cast iron facades. It was a courtship conducted in the language of our shared passion, and it felt safer, more real than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Leo was the barometer of this change. One evening, as I was practicing a slightly more complex piece on the keyboard, a simplified version of Sadie's Gymnopédie, he lingered in the doorway after getting his glass of water. "You're getting better," he stated, not a question. "A little," I said, my fingers pausing over the keys. "It's getting less, slow. Are you happy, Mom?" The question was so direct, so unvarnished, it stole the air from my lungs. I looked at my son, his small face so serious in the dim light. The easy, dishonest answer, "Of course, sweetie," stuck in my throat. He deserved more than that. He had lived through the demolition. "I'm becoming happy," I said carefully. "It's like learning this piano. It's slow, and I make a lot of mistakes, but some days my fingers find the right notes without me having to think too hard. And that feels like a kind of happiness." He nodded, processing this. "Is it because of the architect guy, Xander?" The sound of his name in my son's voice was both startling and comforting. "He's part of it," I admitted. "He's a good person, and he makes me feel seen. But the most important part is you and me. We're building a new house, Leo, and it's going to be a good one." He seemed to accept this, taking a long sip of water. "Okay, can he fix things, like real things?" I smiled. "Yes. He builds things and fixes things." "Cool," he said, and padded back to his room. The inquisition was over, but the permission had been granted. The true test, the first real fusion of my old life and this new, tentative one, came with the promised comical instructions. I had mentioned in passing, during a site meeting, that I'd bought a new bookshelf for the living room, a flat-pack, self-assembly monstrosity that promised Scandinavian simplicity and delivered Nordic-level frustration. I'd been dreading the task, the prospect of wrestling with particle board and ambiguous diagrams alone in the echoing house. Xander had simply looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I live for that stuff. It's like a 3D puzzle. Let me help." And so, on a Saturday afternoon, he appeared at my doorstep, not with flowers, but with a professional-quality cordless drill and a canvas bag full of his own tools. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt from a long-ago rock concert, and he looked more like a musician than an architect. Leo watched, fascinated, from a safe distance on the sofa as we spread the countless pieces of wood, the bags of screws, and the infamous pictogram instructions on the floor. "Okay," Xander said, kneeling and surveying the chaos with the keen eye of a general. "Step 1, identify all parts. This is the most important step. Most people fail here." He wasn't condescending. He was including us. He handed Leo the instruction booklet. "Leo, you're in charge of the map. Call out the part numbers." He looked at me. "Eleanor, you have the eye for detail. You match the pieces to the drawings." What followed was 2 hours of focused, hilarious chaos. The instructions were, as predicted, comically bad. A drawing that was supposed to show how to attach shelf B to side panel A looked like a Rorschach test. Xander took it in stride. "Ah, I see," he'd say, squinting at the diagram. "They want us to believe that this screw magically phases through the solid wood here to connect to this non-existent bracket. A bold design choice. Let's try it the way that actually follows the laws of physics." He'd then engineer a simple, elegant solution, explaining the principle to Leo as he worked. "See, Leo, the trick is to find the true load-bearing point. Everything else is just decoration." Leo, who had been initially shy, was soon kneeling beside him, holding pieces steady and handing him screws. I was the parts runner and the holder of panels, my earlier dread replaced by a warm, expansive feeling I barely recognized. This was what a home was supposed to sound like. Not the silent, tense pauses of a dying marriage, but the whir of a drill, the soft clink of tools, the sound of a man patiently explaining something to a child, and the shared laughter when a piece we'd assembled upside down had to be taken apart. At one point, while I was steadying a large side panel and Xander was drilling, our hands brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it sent a current through me, a live wire of awareness. My eyes met his over the top of the panel. The easygoing humor was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, focused intensity. He didn't look away. The moment stretched, filled only by the fading echo of the drill and the sound of our breathing. It was a juncture, as critical as any we designed for the theater. A point where two separate structures decided to become one. Then Leo dropped a bag of screws with a loud clatter, and the spell was broken. We both laughed, a little breathlessly, and returned to the task at hand. When the last screw was tightened and the bookshelf stood proud and straight against the wall, we all stepped back to admire it. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a testament. We had built this, together. "Looks good," Leo declared, with the finality of a master inspector. "It does," Xander agreed, clapping a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Solid work, team." I looked at the bookshelf, then at my son's proud face, then at Xander, who was wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. The feeling that had been growing in my chest all afternoon finally crystallized. It wasn't just happiness, it was belonging. For the first time since my life had shattered, I felt not like I was patching the pieces back together, but like I was building a new structure, one with a stronger foundation, better materials, and a design that was truly my own. Later, after Leo had gone to bed, buzzing from the excitement and the extra scoop of ice cream he'd been granted as a reward, Xander and I stood in the kitchen. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the lingering energy of the day. "Thank you," I said, leaning against the counter. "For today, for everything." He was washing the dust from his hands at the sink. He turned, drying them on a towel, his gaze soft. "Thank you for letting me in, Eleanor. It was the best Saturday I've had in a long time." He took a step closer. The air between us crackled with the unspoken. The memory of our touch over the bookshelf, the months of shared looks and quiet conversations, all of it converged in this single point. "I should go," he said softly, but he didn't move. I didn't want him to. The fear was still there, a faint, warning whisper in the back of my mind. But it was drowned out by a louder, more insistent sound. The sound of my own heart, no longer in a minor key, finally finding a melody worth playing. I took the final step, closing the distance between us, and reached for his hand. "Or," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "you could stay for a while longer." His fingers intertwined with mine, his grip sure and warm. He brought our joined hands up, his eyes never leaving mine, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. It was a promise, a beginning. "Okay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'd like that." And in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a day spent building something new, the first brick of a future I had never dared to imagine was laid, solid and true. Peace is a structure more fragile than any historic plasterwork. For weeks, I had been living inside the beautiful, new architecture of my life. The solid walls of my work, the warm windows of my time with Leo, the strong, steady foundation of what was growing with Xander. I had begun to believe the demolition was complete, the rubble cleared, and the new blueprint was unfolding without significant complication. I was wrong. The past doesn't always return with a bang. Sometimes, it just parks its familiar, dusty sedan at the curb and rings the doorbell. It was a Sunday afternoon. Xander had taken Leo to the Science Museum to see a new exhibit on deep-sea exploration, a male-bonding expedition I had encouraged with a mixture of gratitude and quiet delight. The house was mine, filled with the soft, focused silence of my piano practice. I was wrestling with the left-hand accompaniment of a Chopin prelude, my fingers slowly finding the muscle memory for the haunting, repetitive pattern. The doorbell chimed, a clean, electronic sound that felt like an intrusion. I assumed it was a package or a neighbor. I wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted me when I opened the door. Daniel. He stood on the porch, looking like a ghost from a previous life. He had lost weight. His suit, usually impeccable, was slightly rumpled, and there were shadows under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. He held a small, gift-wrapped box in his hands. "Eleanor," he said, my name a sigh on his lips. My entire body went cold, then hot. The carefully constructed piece of the last few months shattered like glass. The Chopin prelude evaporated from my mind, replaced by the deafening roar of that night in the restaurant. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" My voice was flat, a historian addressing a vandal. I was in the neighborhood. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. We lived 20 miles from his new apartment. I wanted to see you, to talk, and to give this to Leo. He held up the gift. For his birthday next week. You could have mailed it. I didn't move from the doorway. I wouldn't let him cross the threshold. This was my sanctuary now, and he had forfeited his right to enter. I know. He trailed off, his eyes scanning my face, then drifting past me into the house. His gaze landed on the bookshelf, the one Xander and I and Leo had built together. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He could sense it. The change in the atmosphere, the new furniture, the absence of the artifacts he recognized. The presence of a life that didn't include him. Who is he? The question was quiet, stripped of the right to be demanding, but laced with a raw curiosity that bordered on pain. That is none of your business. The words were firm, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. This was the confrontation I had avoided, the ghost I had refused to acknowledge. Is it serious? He pressed, his voice tightening. Why do you care, Daniel? You made your choice, you chose Sarah. Saying her name aloud was like spitting out poison. You don't get to audit my recovery. This isn't recovery, Alina, this is replacement, he snapped, a flash of the old frustration surfacing. It's been barely 6 months. You've just let some stranger move in on my son on my... Stop. The word cut through the air, sharp and final. The coldness in my voice surprised even me. You do not get to say my son. You see him on weekends, you buy him gifts, you are his father. But this, I gestured around me at the house, at my life, this is my home, and Leo's. You lost any claim to the architecture of this life when you decided to tear it down from the inside. You don't get to complain about the new design. He flinched as if I'd struck him. The gift box hung limply in his hand. The confident architect was gone, replaced by a man staring at the blueprints of a building he had deliberately set on fire. I miss you, he whispered, the fight draining out of him. I made a terrible, stupid, unforgivable mistake. I know that, but what we had... It was 12 years, Alina. Doesn't that count for anything? I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt not a surge of hatred, but a profound, bone-deep pity. He was a man trying to glue the pieces of a shattered vase back together, not understanding that even if he succeeded, it would never hold water again. It would only ever be a display of its own brokenness. It counted for everything, Daniel, I said, my voice softening despite my best efforts. That's why it's so broken. You don't rebuild on a fractured foundation. You condemn the site and you build anew somewhere else. That's what I'm doing. Tears welled in his eyes. And there's no place for me in the new build, not even as a visitor. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I thought of Leo's laughter with Xander. I thought of the feeling of belonging, of being seen. I thought of the hidden star in the theater ceiling, a beauty that had been there all along, waiting for the right light to reveal it. No, I said, the word quiet but absolute. There isn't. Our story is in the archives now, Daniel. It's a reference for the future, not a place to live. I reached out and took the gift-wrapped box from his unresisting hand. I'll make sure Leo gets this. Thank you. It was a dismissal. A closing of a very heavy, very final door. He stood there for a moment longer, a statue of regret on my porch. Then he nodded slowly, turned, and walked back to his car without another word. I closed the door, leaning my back against it, my legs trembling. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had exhausted me. I slid down to the floor, the cool wood against my skin, and breathed deeply. And then, a strange thing happened. I waited for the tsunami of grief, the anger, the doubt to crash over me, but it didn't come. Instead, what washed over me was a profound, unshakable certainty. I had faced the ghost of my past, and I had not been tempted to follow him back into the ruins. I had stood my ground on the new foundation I had built. The doorbell had been a stress test, and my new structure had held. When Xander and Leo returned later, bursting through the door with stories of giant squid and submersibles, I was at the piano, the Chopin prelude flowing from my fingers with a new, sure-handed confidence. Leo ran up to me. Mom, we saw a robot that can go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Xander hung back, his eyes meeting mine over Leo's head. He saw something in my face, a new stillness, a resolved calm. He didn't ask. He just gave me a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement that I had faced a storm and remained standing. I smiled back, and in that moment, I knew the last of the ghosts had been laid to rest. The past was no longer a place I lived in. It was simply a chapter I had read. And I was finally, irrevocably, ready to write the next one. The blueprint for our future was no longer a theoretical drawing. It was a set of weathered, coffee-stained plans spread across the plywood floor of what would become the kitchen. The farmhouse was less a structure and more a promise. A skeleton of potential standing proudly on 5 acres of rolling Colorado land, dotted with aspens that would turn to gold in the fall. It was a century old, with a sagging porch, a roof that needed immediate attention, and plumbing that was more of a suggestion than a system. But the bones were magnificent. Hand-hewn beams, thick stone foundations, and a quiet, sturdy dignity that had endured decades of neglect. Xander had found it. Of course he had. He'd been casually browsing listings for months, he later admitted, looking for a project that could be ours instead of just mine. "It's too much," I'd whispered the first time we'd walked through it, my voice echoing in the empty, dusty living room. The scale of the renovation was terrifying. "It's perfect," he'd countered, his eyes alight with that specific fire I'd come to adore, the architect's glee at a beautiful problem. "It's a history that's still standing. We're not building from scratch. We're just helping it remember what it was meant to be." The purchase was a leap of faith, a joint venture that felt more significant than any legal document. It was our shared declaration of intent. This would not be his house or my house. It would be our house, the one we built together. Now, on a bright Saturday morning, we were initiating the project with the first, most symbolic task, fixing the front porch. Leo was with us, designated as the official tool passer and safety inspector, a role he took with grave seriousness. The air was filled with the sounds of our new beginning. The whine of a circular saw cutting new decking boards, the rhythmic thud of Xander's hammer driving nails with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of building, the tinny sound of a classic rock station playing from his phone, and my own, less confident but determined hammering as I worked on replacing a section of the balustrade. It was a ballet of comical instructions, but these were written not by a Scandinavian furniture company, but by the unforgiving laws of physics and century-old craftsmanship. "Okay, Aliner," Xander said, holding a long level against a new post I was trying to secure. "You see how it's leaning? Just a hair to the east. That's the difference between a porch that lasts another 100 years and one that sags in 5. It's all in the foundation." He didn't take the tools from me. He guided my hands, his voice patient and calm. He showed me how to adjust the base, how to shim it with a sliver of wood until the bubble in the level was perfectly, magically centered. "There," he said, a smile in his voice. "Now it's true." I looked from the perfectly level post to his face, dust smudged on his cheek, and felt a surge of something so powerful it stole my breath. This was the positive trait I'd randomly been given, brought to life. He can fix anything with his hands. But it was more than that. It was his patience in teaching me, his unwavering belief that I could learn, that I could be a part of the creating, not just the curating. Leo, bored with our precision, had found a stack of old, weathered shingles and was carefully arranging them into a fort for a family of imaginary frogs. He was chattering to himself, completely at ease in this chaotic, dusty paradise. He looked up and saw us looking at each other. "Are you guys gonna kiss now?" he asked, with the brutal, unvarnished curiosity of a child. Xander burst out laughing, a rich, unguarded sound that echoed in the quiet valley. My face flushed, but I was laughing too. "Maybe later, bud," Xander said, winking at me. "Right now, we've got a porch to build." The moment was light, but it was another juncture, another critical connection being made. Leo was not just accepting Xander's presence. He was integrating him into the narrative of his life, teasing him, including him in the family script. As the day wore on, we fell into a natural rhythm. Xander handled the heavy structural work. I focused on the detailed finish carpentry, and Leo was our runner, our cheerleader, and our comic relief. We broke for a lunch of sandwiches and lemonade. Sitting on the steps of the porch we were actively saving, looking out at the land that was now ours. "I was thinking," Xander said, gesturing with his sandwich towards a cluster of pine trees. "We could run a flagstone path over there, to a fire pit, for marshmallows. And for telling scary stories," Leo added, his mouth full. "Absolutely for scary stories," Xander agreed. "And maybe, off the back of the house, we could build a screened-in porch. so you can watch the thunderstorms roll in without getting wet. He was including us in his vision, building our dreams into the blueprint. He wasn't just designing a house, he was designing a life. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, golden shadows, we stood back to admire our work. The new section of the porch floor was down, smooth and level. The new balustrade stood straight and proud. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of the renovation, but it felt monumental. We had taken something broken and made it solid. Together. I looked at Xander, his arms slung casually around my shoulders, and at Leo, who was trying to balance a hammer on his finger. The air was cool and smelled of pine and sawdust. The memory of the sterile, painful silence of my old home felt like a lifetime ago. This noise, this chaos, this shared, tangible progress, this was the sound of a new foundation being laid, not just for a house, but for a family. We had started with a bookshelf. Now we had a farmhouse. The scale had changed, but the principle was the same. We were building one true, level, lovingly crafted piece at a time. And for the first time, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was a structure that would not just endure, but would thrive. The farmhouse was no longer a skeleton. It was a body, breathing with the sounds of our lives. The scent of fresh paint and sawn wood was slowly being replaced by the aroma of coffee, and more often than not, the faint, sweet smell of something baking, or more accurately, something often attempting to be baked. Our failed baking attempts that end in a flour fight had become a weekend ritual, a glorious, messy celebration of our imperfect, perfect new normal. We had moved in a month ago. The master bedroom had a new roof and a king-sized bed we'd chosen together. Leo's room was painted a deep, cosmic blue, with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling in the precise constellations Xander had taught him. The kitchen was the heart of it all, still dotted with a few unpacked boxes, but dominated by a large, reclaimed wood table we'd found at a flea market and refinished ourselves. Another project with comical instructions and a satisfying result. It was a Sunday evening. The remains of a homemade pizza, Xander's perfectly shaped, mine a little lopsided, Leo's a bizarre but delicious monument to excessive cheese, lay on the table. The mood was soft, languid, filled with the contentment of a day spent together. "Okay, team," Xander said, pushing his plate away. "Important question, brownies or chocolate chip cookies?" "Brownies," Leo declared instantly. "Cookies," I countered with a smile. "More opportunities for quality control of the dough." Xander pointed a finger at me. "A woman after my own heart. Cookies it is." He stood and started pulling out ingredients, a man utterly at home in his domain. I cleared the plates and began washing up, watching them from the sink. Leo, now 10, had dragged a stool over to the counter to help. His brow furrowed in concentration as Xander showed him how to cream the butter and sugar together. "See, Leo, you want it light and fluffy. That's what gives the cookie its texture. It's a chemical reaction, not just mixing." "A chemical reaction," Leo repeated, seriously, watching the paddle of the mixer with the focus of a lab scientist. This was the positive trait, the one the randomization had gifted me, woven into the fabric of our days. He is an amazing cook and loves to host dinners. But it was so much more than that. It was the patience, the teaching, the way he effortlessly folded Leo into the process, making him a co-conspirator in creation. He was building more than cookies. He was building confidence and memories and a sense of belonging for my son. As the cookies baked, filling the house with an unbearably delicious scent, we drifted into the living room. The piano, my old electronic keyboard, now had a place of honor near the stone fireplace. Xander had built a beautiful wooden stand for it. I sat and began to play the piece I'd been working on for weeks, the simplified version of Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was still hesitant in places, the left-hand arpeggios not quite as fluid as I wanted, but it was recognizable. It was music. I felt rather than saw Xander and Leo settle on the sofa behind me. I played through to the end, the final, quiet notes fading into the warm air. Silence hung for a moment, then Leo started clapping. "You didn't mess up any of it that time, Mom," he said, his praise the most honest and rewarding I'd ever received. I turned on the stool. Xander was just looking at me, his expression so full of naked admiration and love that it made my breath catch. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes and gave a single, approving nod. It was the same look he gave a perfectly leveled beam or a seamlessly executed architectural detail. It was the look of a creator appreciating something done well. The timer on the oven dinged. The next hour was a chaos of warm cookies, cold milk, and a board game that descended into hilarious arguments over the rules. We were a tangle of limbs on the rug in front of the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of our home. Leo, hyped on sugar and happiness, eventually crashed, his head landing in Xander's lap mid-sentence about his next move. Xander looked down at the sleeping boy, then up at me. His hand came to rest gently on Leo's back, a slow, calming circle. The gesture was so natural, so paternal, it sent a wave of pure, unadulterated joy through me. "He's a great kid, Aliner," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You've done an incredible job with him." "We're doing an okay job with him," I corrected, my voice thick. His eyes met mine, and the understanding in them was a solid, tangible thing. He wasn't trying to replace Daniel. He was becoming something else entirely. A stepfather, a mentor, a rock. He was the architect of Leo's sense of security, and he was building it with the same care and integrity he built everything else. Later, after we'd carried a drowsy Leo to bed and tucked him in, Xander and I stood on our repaired porch, under a blanket of a million stars. The air was crisp, and the silence of the country was a profound, living thing. "This," I whispered, leaning into his solid warmth, "this is the life he could never have given me, the life I could never have had with him." Xander wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. "This is the life we're building, Aliner, together." And as I looked up at the vast, star-dusted Colorado sky, I realized the transformation was complete. The woman who had been shattered in a restaurant, who had fled to the glaciers, who had painstakingly learned to build a new world note by note, board by board, was gone. In her place was a woman who was whole, not in spite of her cracks, but because of them. They were the places where the light of this new love, this new family, could shine through. The grief was now a fossil, a layer of rock deep beneath the fertile soil of my present. It was part of the foundation, but it no longer defined the structure. The house was built. The family was home. Time, which had once felt like a jagged shard of glass, had smoothed into a river, flowing with a deep, steady current. It had been 2 years since the day I walked out of the restaurant, 3 since Xander and I had stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the stars and feeling the future settle around us like a warm blanket. The transformation was no longer a process, it was a state of being. We were no longer building, we were living within the structure we had created, and it was strong. The farmhouse was no longer a renovation project, but a home, worn and loved into its bones. The porch we had fixed now held rocking chairs where we drank our morning coffee. The kitchen where we'd had our flower fights now hosted bustling family dinners and quiet, late-night talks. The living room with the piano had witnessed countless evenings of music, board games, and Leo, now 12, sprawled on the rug doing his homework. It was a crisp autumn Saturday, the aspens on our property a blazing canopy of gold. We were hosting a harvest party, a notion that would have been unthinkable in my previous life. That life had been about curated perfection, about appearances. This life was about abundance, about sharing the messy, joyful overflow of our happiness. Xander was in his element, the gracious host, manning a grill laden with burgers and sausages, a cold beer in his hand as he held court with a group of our friends. He caught my eye from across the yard and winked, a silent, intimate signal that never failed to make my heart flip. I was carrying a large bowl of potato salad towards the long, picnic table we'd built when a familiar car pulled up the gravel drive. "Daniel," my steps didn't falter. The cold dread that had once accompanied his presence was gone, replaced by a neutral, almost compassionate calm. He was part of the landscape of our past, a neighboring mountain that no longer cast a shadow on our valley. He was here for Leo, for his scheduled weekend, and he'd agreed to stop by the party for a bit first. He got out of the car, looking older, more settled. The frantic desperation from his visit on my doorstep had been replaced by a weary acceptance. His eyes took in the scene. The vibrant, noisy crowd, the smoke from the grill, the children, including Leo, playing a chaotic game of tag among the trees, the thriving farmhouse that was so clearly a labor of love. He saw Xander clap a hand on Leo's shoulder as he ran by. A gesture so natural and affectionate it was like a language they both spoke fluently. He saw the easy way I moved through the party, the laughter that came readily to my lips. I walked over to him. "Daniel, I'm glad you could make it." He nodded, his eyes still scanning, taking in the evidence of a life that was full and complete without him. "It's quite a place you've got here, Alina." "It's home," I said simply. He watched as Leo, breathless and laughing, ran up to Xander, who handed him a burger with a theatrical flourish. Leo took a huge bite and then, with his mouth full, said something that made Xander throw his head back and laugh. "He's happy," Daniel said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a surrender, a final, quiet laying down of arms. "He is," I agreed. "We all are." He turned to me then, and I saw no bitterness in his face, only a profound, sad regret. "I look at this, at what you've built, and I finally understand what I destroyed. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a potential for this, for a life that's real." He shook his head. "My life with Sarah, it was a fever dream. It burned hot and fast and left nothing but ashes. This," he gestured at the vibrant party, the solid house, the family, "this is built to last." I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure, the last page of a long, difficult book being gently turned. "It is," I whispered. He stayed for one polite drink, made small talk with a few people, and then left with a promise to have Leo back on Sunday evening. As his car disappeared down the drive, I felt the final, invisible thread tethering me to the past snap, not with a bang, but with a soft, sighing release. The party wound down as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Our friends departed with hugs and promises to do it again soon, leaving behind the happy debris of a day well spent. Leo, exhausted from the day, fell asleep on the sofa almost immediately, a half-eaten cookie still in his hand. Xander and I moved through the quiet house, wordlessly cleaning up in the companionable silence that was the hallmark of our union. We didn't need to fill the space with noise. Our connection was in the shared task, the passing of a plate, the meeting of eyes over the sink. When the last dish was put away, he took my hand and led me outside onto the porch. The air was cold and clear, and the first stars were pricking through the velvet sky. He pulled me into his arms, and we stood there, wrapped in each other and the silence of the night. "He was here," I said softly, my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reliable beat of his heart. "I saw," Xander said, his chin resting on my head. "Are you okay?" I leaned back to look at him, at the man who had remembered how I took my coffee, who had taught me to build a porch, who had loved my son as his own, who had given me a world where I was not a relic of a broken past, but the architect of a beautiful present. "I'm more than okay," I said, my voice thick with emotion. When I stood in that restaurant, when the world fell apart, I thought it was the end of everything. I thought I was being erased, but I was wrong. I was just being renovated. All the pain, the betrayal, the grief, it was just the necessary demolition. It cleared the space for this. For you, for us. He cupped my face in his hands, his calloused thumbs wiping away the tears I hadn't realized were falling. His eyes, in the starlight, were pools of unwavering love and certainty. "You are the strongest, most beautiful thing I have ever seen being built, Alina," he whispered. "And it is the privilege of my life to get to live in the world you create." He kissed me then, a kiss that was not a beginning, nor a desperate promise, but a seal. A confirmation of the life we had chosen, of the family we had forged, of the love that was no longer a fragile sapling, but a deeply rooted, ancient tree. As we stood there, wrapped in the warmth of our home and the certainty of our future, I knew the story was complete. The arc that began in the shattering light of a betrayal had curved, through pain and self-discovery, through struggle and grace, to land here, in this quiet, unshakable peace. The upgrade was finished. The system was stable. The historian had not just preserved the past. She had used its lessons to build a future, and in doing so, had finally come home.